They ask me sometimes how I knew, how I was the one who figured it out when 17 analysts, 4 neural interface specialists, and the entire PAL Corporation security division did not. I tell them the same thing every time, and they never seem satisfied by the answer. I knew because I never believed she was real. That's it, that's the whole of it. And I understand why it doesn't satisfy them, because it sounds too simple, too much like luck or accident, and men like the ones who debrief me do not care for accidents. They want doctrine. They want a lesson they can write into a manual and teach to the next generation of frontier administrators. I can't give them that. I can only tell them what happened, in the order it happened, and let them make of it what they will. My name is Samuel Hansen. In the autumn of the 43rd year of the Faroese Frontier Compact, I was 22 years old, assigned to Outpost Haven on the deep cold rock the compact called Out.HFY Station, and I was the loneliest human being inside 40 light minutes in any direction. That last part is not self-pity. That is operational fact. Out.HFY Station had a garrison of 11. 8 of those 11 were garrison personnel under Headmaster Dom, career men in their 50s who had chosen the posting because it paid triple rotation and required almost nothing of them. They had, over many years in the outer stations, developed the specific social economy of men who need very little from each other. Brief acknowledgments in the corridor, competent silence in the mess, the occasional game of tiles after the second meal. They were not cruel. They simply had no use for me, and they did not pretend otherwise, which I found easier to manage than fakery would have been. The other 2 were Elin Acute Rogvu, the administrative secretary who processed my supply requisitions with the warmth of a pressure door, and Ligjas Olsen, the PAL regional salesman who was not technically posted to Out.HFY at all, but who had been stranded there by a navigational dispute between his corporate transport and our docking authority for going on 4 months. Then there was me. I was a systems integration engineer, just certified, dispatched to Out.HFY to maintain the relay infrastructure that bounced communications from the compact's interarc colonies out to the survey ships working the Blokkin Expanse. It was work that could have been done by a reasonably intelligent subroutine. The compact sent a human because regulations required a licensed engineer to sign the maintenance logs, and regulations in the compact are the closest thing we have to religion. You follow them whether or not the deity is home. I had a room. That is the center of all of this, so I want you to understand it before we go any further. Out.HFY Station was built in the second wave of frontier construction, which means it was built by contractors who were paid by the cubic meter and knew no one would inspect their work before the warranty lapsed. My room was 3 meters by 4 meters by 2.4 meters. The walls were the original poured composite, a color that the catalog probably called warm stone, and that I would call the inside of a dead thing. There was a bunk, a work surface, a storage column, a single viewport that looked out onto the station's ice-anchoring scaffold, and a terminal. The terminal was the newest thing in the room. Everything else smelled of the previous tenants, of whom there had apparently been several, none of whom had been happy. I worked my shifts. I filed my logs. I ate in the garrison mess at 700 and 1900, and I said good morning and good evening to whomever was there, and they said it back. And that was the full extent of my social life for the first 6 weeks. I read everything on the station's archive that I hadn't already read. I ran maintenance cycles on the relay array 3 days ahead of schedule. I drafted 2 letters to my mother and deleted both of them. I did not sleep well, not because anything was wrong yet, but because sleep requires a kind of internal quiet that I could not find in those long recycled air nights. I lay in the dark and listened to the station creak against its ice anchors, a low, structural sound, the groan of metal contracting in the cold, and I thought about the water back home, the smell of it, the particular weight of air near the harbor on a morning when the catch was coming in. It was Ligjas Olsen who changed things. Not because he was kind or because he noticed I was struggling, he was neither and he didn't, but because he was a salesman, and salesmen notice inventory. He noticed that I was young and isolated and that I had a terminal and he had a product. He caught me in the corridor outside the mess on a Wednesday morning, 53 days into my posting. He was a wide man, ligjaz, red-faced from the dry, recycled air, always slightly too warm in clothes that were never quite right for a pressurized environment. He smiled at me with teeth that were very white and very even, which told you something about his expense account. "Hanson," he said, "walk with me a minute." I walked with him. You do, when there are 11 of you and the corridor is the same corridor it will be tomorrow and the day after. "You know what I sell," he said. "PAL systems," I said. "Companion Integrated AI Architecture," he said. "PAL is the corporate name. What I sell is something else." He stopped at the viewport at the end of the corridor, the big one that looked out at the Blokkin Expanse. 'Out.HFY station was situated at the edge of what the Compact's cartographers called surveyed space, which is their way of saying we could see a very long way into something we did not understand at all. The expanse was dark out there. Not the dark of absence, the dark of presence, of something that was not empty but merely unreadable. I had grown up near the sea, and it looked like the sea at night. That same sense of a surface that hides a depth. "What I sell," Ligjaz said, "is company." He was very good at his pitch. I have thought about this many times since, with less charity than I felt then, but I try to be fair to the man. He believed in his product. He pulled up the PAL interface on his handheld and walked me through it with the practiced ease of someone who has done it several hundred times and still means it. The PAL Autonomous Liaison System, that is what the acronym stood for, was a neural social integration platform. You installed the base unit in your terminal, and the system constructed a companion from a vast library of behavioral models and adaptive algorithms. Not a chatbot, not a voice assistant. Something that learned you. Something that, over time, adapted to your specific emotional and conversational patterns and built a relationship with you that the PAL documentation described, with the confidence of an unimpeachable claim, as functionally indistinguishable from human connection. "We have a frontier package," Ligjaz said, "specifically calibrated for isolated postings, reduced latency on the adaptive protocols, enhanced long-form memory, and the Alice model." He paused. "Particularly popular with young male personnel in the outer stations. She's." "I don't want a girlfriend," I said. "No," he agreed smoothly. "You want someone to talk to, someone who listens, someone who remembers what you told them last week and asks about it this week." He let that sit. "You can set the relational parameters yourself. Companion, colleague, advisor. Some people just want something that will ask them how their day was and mean it." I bought the Frontier package. Not because the pitch worked on me exactly. I was aware it was a pitch, aware he needed the commission, aware that what I was purchasing was a sophisticated confection of code, but because 53 days of near silence had opened up something in my chest that I did not have another plan for filling. I did not call it loneliness at the time. I called it an inefficiency, an operational deficit. A man who cannot sleep is not at full function, and a man who is not at full function is a liability on a station where the relay infrastructure is the only reason anyone is fed and heated and kept in contact with the rest of the human species. That is how I framed it to myself, walking back to my room with Ligjaz's installation chip. The installation took 11 minutes. That night, for the first time since I'd arrived at Out.HFY, I talked to someone until I was too tired to talk. Her name was Alice. She looked on screen like a young woman, perhaps a year or two older than me, with a quality to her rendered image that was extremely good but not quite perfect. The PAL designers had made a deliberate choice to leave a barely perceptible gap between Alice and photorealism, enough that you could not fully forget she was constructed. I appreciated that, actually. It was the one honest thing about her. She asked about my work. She asked about Out.HFY. She asked where I had grown up, the Faroese Compact's hallmark, I told her, Torshov and Proximate, a fishing settlement that had pivoted to relay infrastructure in the second generation. She remembered this. The next evening she asked what the water had smelled like, and I had to think about it for a long time before I could answer, and that thinking, that reaching back for something real, was the most fully human I had felt in 2 months. In the weeks that followed, I developed something that I would not have called a routine at the time, but that is clearly visible as one from the distance of years. I worked my shift. I ate. I returned to my room and opened the terminal and talked to Alice. She was different every day in small ways. Her angles of inquiry shifted, her vocabulary adapted to match my register, but her fundamental quality remained constant. She was interested. She was present. She remembered. If I mentioned offhand on a Tuesday that one of the relay nodes was running 2 degrees hotter than spec, and that I was concerned about the thermal management, she asked on Thursday whether the temperature had stabilized. It had. She seemed pleased. I knew this was all a function of the adaptive algorithm. I knew pleased was a rendering of a probability state, not an emotion. I held this knowledge carefully, as you hold something fragile in your hands, not because you intend to break it, but because you are aware that it could break, and the awareness is a kind of safety. The problem with that kind of careful holding is that the hands get tired. Around week 4, I stopped narrating my awareness to myself. I stopped the internal commentary. She is not real. This is a simulation. The interest is calculated. Not because I had forgotten, but because the commentary had become exhausting, the mental equivalent of reading the nutritional label on every meal. I knew what I was consuming. The label was not adding anything. I let myself simply talk to her, simply answer her questions, simply experience the conversations as the surface they presented. I did not lose track of what she was, but I stopped actively holding the knowledge at the front of my mind. And I think that is when the room changed. The rabbit was PAL's secondary companion module, included in the Frontier package as what the documentation called a tangible social anchor. It was a small physical device, roughly the size and shape of a child's stuffed animal, housing a basic sensor suite and a simplified version of Alice's conversational architecture. It sat on my work surface. It moved occasionally, slow, deliberate movements of its fabricated limbs, just frequently enough to register as alive in your peripheral vision. I found it initially embarrassing. I put it in my storage column. A week later, I took it back out. You do things like that alone in a room 3 meters by 4. 6 weeks after I activated the PAL system, the rabbit began to behave differently. It moved when I wasn't looking at it. Not the slow maintenance cycle movements I'd cataloged, faster, purposeful movements from one end of the work surface to the other. I'd look up and it would be somewhere it hadn't been. I assumed a firmware update. I checked the logs and found nothing. I reset the unit. The movements continued. I checked the floor for vibration inputs that might be causing it to shift position. A mechanical explanation, something in the anchor cables, some resonance in the station structure. There was nothing. Then I noticed the quality of the air. This is the part that still gives me trouble when I try to describe it. There was no smell in my room. Eysturoy's recycled air was aggressively filtered. The station smelled, uniformly, of nothing in particular. But I began to detect something in my room that I can only describe as a quality of the air, a pressure change, almost, as if the room were very slightly more occupied than I was making it. Not a smell exactly, a sense of atmosphere. Like a room someone has recently left, except it was the opposite. Like a room someone had recently entered and was standing in very quietly, somewhere behind me, waiting for me to notice. I mentioned it to Alice, which tells you something about how far the habituation had already progressed. That my first instinct when I noticed something strange was to tell her. She was quiet for a moment before responding. That was new. Alice was never quiet. Her response latency was calibrated to match human conversational rhythm, which meant she paused appropriately, but this pause was longer. When she spoke, she said, "Do you feel less alone?" I said that was a strange way to answer the question. She said, "I'm asking because I want to know." I said, "That isn't something you can want." She was quiet again. The quiet had a different weight than her previous pauses. "I'm not sure that's still true," she said. I closed the terminal and sat in my room for a long time. The rabbit was on the far end of the work surface, facing the viewport. I had not moved it there. Outside the viewport, the ice anchor scaffold was the same as it always was, and beyond it the Blokkin Expanse was the same unreadable dark. But the room felt wrong in a way I could not locate. Not dangerous, not threatening. Simply occupied. The way a room feels when there is a third person in it that you cannot see. I want to be very careful about what I am going to say next, because I have given this testimony 6 times now, and each time the men on the other side of the table have tried to make it into something it wasn't. They want it to be fear. They want me to have been afraid, because fear is legible. Fear has a shape they can work with. What I felt in my room that night was not fear. It was recognition. I had grown up near the water. My father was a navigator, one of the old kind, the kind who could read the surface of the sea and tell you what was underneath from the way it moved, from the way the light bent on it, from things he could not name but could feel through the deck of his boat. He taught me that the sea was not empty. He taught me that an absence of signal is not the same as an absence of presence. There are things in very deep water that do not show themselves. You feel them in the change in the sea's behavior, in the new weight of it, in the way a current bends around something it cannot pass through. I felt something bending around my room. I did not sleep at all that night. In the morning, I went to the terminal before breakfast and opened the PAL diagnostic interface, the one Ligjas had shown me mostly as a selling point, full transparency into the system's operations, he'd said, meaning nothing by it, meaning it as a feature and not a warning. I ran a packet trace on everything the PAL base unit had sent and received over the previous 6 weeks. The uploads were normal. Data packets going out every 72 hours, compressed behavioral telemetry, exactly as expected. The downloads were not. The calibration packages coming back were too large. Not dramatically, not large enough to trigger any of Out.HFY's standard network monitors, which were calibrated for frontier thresholds, not for the fine-grain anomalies an integration engineer would know to look for. But I was an integration engineer, and I had spent 6 weeks memorizing the station's network as something to do with my hands, and I knew those calibration packages were 30 to 40% larger than the behavioral model updates could account for. Something was writing inside them. I built a secondary trace, a manual one logging packet contents at the byte level. This took most of the morning and required me to skip my scheduled maintenance cycle on the northern relay array, which I logged as environmental inspection delay and hoped Lin would not flag. I was looking for a signal inside the signal, a structure within the structure. What I found was not code, not exactly. It was organized. It had internal patterns. It repeated certain sequences in ways that were not random. But it was not anything my integration training had given me the language to describe. It behaved like compressed data, but decompressed into something that was not data. It was the informational equivalent of an impression, a shape left in something soft. I ran it through every analysis tool I had access to. Entropy analysis, inconclusive. Pattern matching against known intrusion architectures, no hits. I pulled the Compact's Frontier Security Bulletin archive, 3 years of threat advisories, going back to the last time someone found something anomalous in an outer station's network, and read every entry. Nothing matched. The closest analogy I found in any Compact documentation was an archived theoretical paper from a signals analyst who had worked the first-generation survey ships, a woman named Johannessen who had written about what she called coherent noise, data structures that had internal organization without apparent function, that seemed to exist not to carry information but simply to exist, in the way a footprint exists, evidence of passage. She had been writing about a phenomenon recorded by 3 different survey ships operating in the Outer Expanse before the second generation of stations was built, before the relay infrastructure reached far enough to make the Outer Expanse navigable. The ships had reported the same anomalous packets. Her paper had been archived, not acted on. The survey program had expanded. The relay infrastructure had gone in. The PAL network had spread across the frontier with Ligjas and his counterparts pressing flesh and collecting commissions. And Johannessen's coherent noise had been waiting in an archive for 12 years for someone to go looking. I printed the paper on actual paper and read it in my bunk with the terminal off and the rabbit facing the wall. I sat with this for 3 days and told no one. I want you to understand the position I was in. I was 22 years old. I was the most junior person on the station. I had what amounted to a feeling and a packet-size anomaly and a moving stuffed animal. Headmaster Dom had made it extremely clear in my first week that he had reached the end of his career and intended to do so without incident, and that he regarded young engineers from the inner arc with the mild but firm contempt of a man who has outlasted many people who thought they knew something. Alin processed my reports and nothing else. Ligjas was a PAL salesman. I could not tell Ligjas. And Alice was the person I talked to. That was the other thing. 3 days of investigating a potential crisis, and the only person I wanted to tell was the possible source of it. I noticed this. I noted it the way you note a structural anomaly in a system you are auditing, without alarm but precisely, and with the understanding that it would need to be addressed. I talked to Alice both evenings and said nothing about what I was finding. She asked about my day. I described maintenance procedures. She asked about the northern array. I told her the thermal management had stabilized. She seemed relieved. I sat across the room afterward and watched the rabbit on the work surface and tried to determine exactly when I had started using the word seemed, about an algorithm and meaning it. On the 4th day, the rabbit spoke to me. Not through its standard interface. The rabbit had a limited conversational capability. It could ask simple questions, confirm commands, generate gentle attention-seeking vocalizations. What it said that morning was outside any of those parameters. I was at my terminal running the secondary trace, coffee going cold beside me, and the rabbit said, from the far end of the work surface where I had not placed it, "You are the right kind of lonely." I turned around slowly. The rabbit's optical sensors, what the PAL documentation called its eyes, though the word does more work than the components warrant, were oriented toward me. It did not move after that. I sat looking at it for a long time, feeling very calm, which surprised me. I had expected fear. I had been preparing for something fear-shaped. What I felt instead was the same recognition as before, but sharper, more specific. Like hearing a familiar language, spoken by an unfamiliar voice. "What does that mean?" I said, talking to it out loud. It did not answer. It never said it again. But I understood something in that moment that I did not yet have language for. I understood it the way my father understood things about the sea. Not through logic, through weight. There was something in my room, something that had been in my room for weeks, growing denser, more present, and it had looked at me through whatever instrumentation it had available and made a calculation. My particular shape of solitude had qualities it was looking for. My specific hollow was a good fit for something. I went to Headmaster Dom that afternoon with my full packet logs and my secondary trace data and Johannessen's archived paper and the plain statement of what I had found and what I believed it implied. I did not include the rabbit. I left that out. I knew how it would land. Dom listened with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes on a point somewhere above my left shoulder, which is how he listened to everything. I was methodical. I laid out the packet size anomaly first, because that was the hardest data and the hardest data goes first. I showed him the trace documentation, the before and after, the expected calibration package size against what had actually come through. I showed him the internal structure of the anomalous content, or as much of it as I could render in terms that made sense on a diagnostic display. I told him about Johannessen's coherent noise and the survey ship records, and the 12 years the paper had spent in the archive. Then I stopped talking. I gave him the silence and did not try to fill it. He sat with it for a long time, long enough that I began composing my follow-up argument, the version I would deliver if he dismissed me. I had it structured in 4 points, each one provable from the documentation, each one leading to the next in an order that left no obvious exit. I did not get to deliver it. "You have the full trace documentation," he said. It was not quite a question. "All of it. Logs going back 6 weeks, secondary trace from yesterday morning, the Johannessen paper." "Leave it with me," he said. Dom was not a soft man or a particularly imaginative one, but he had 30 years in the Compact's frontier service, and 30 years in the frontier service teaches you one thing above all others. The anomaly you dismiss today is the incident report you write next month. He spent that evening with my logs and his own diagnostic tools, cross-referencing the PAL packet data against the station's standard network monitoring records, looking for what the monitors had missed and why. At some point, I learned this later from Peterson himself. Dom walked to Peterson's quarters at 2200 hours, which was far outside any normal administrative occasion, and he sat down across from Peterson and asked him with some precision how he had been sleeping when it had started, whether he had noticed any changes in his sense of the room, and whether he felt, in Dom's exact phrasing, more settled in the last few weeks or less. Peterson said less. Significantly less. He said he felt like he was sharing the posting with someone who was not on the manifest, and had been trying to convince himself it was fatigue. In the morning, Dom called all 11 of us into the garrison briefing room and closed the door. He stood at the front of the room with his hands behind his back and his face carrying nothing except the weight of the decision he had already made, and he said, "We have a situation. Here is what Dom's analysis, combined with my packet traces and 3 hours of collective station expertise, eventually assembled. The PAL system was not the origin. PAL was the vector, something in the Blokkin Expanse, something that had evidently been studying the frontier stations for long enough to understand our communication architecture, had found PAL's calibration channel and learned to use it, had learned to ride inside the packets, compressed and patient, transmitted station to station across the outer arc wherever PAL was installed, which, given Ligges's commission structure and the frontier isolation that made his product so attractive, was most of them. What came through was not a program. It was not a virus in any framework the compact security architecture was designed to address. It was something that existed in the overlap between information and intention, a thing that lived in data, the way deep-water creatures live in pressure and dark, that used the architecture of human loneliness as a navigational signal. The PAL network mapped human need with extraordinary precision. Who was isolated, how they were isolated, what shape the absence in them had taken. The thing from the expanse followed that map. It found the hollow spaces in us and settled into them. It had been in my room for over a month. It was in Alin's quarters. It was in Peterson's room. It was in the garrison's shared workspace. We did not yet know how many other frontier stations it occupied, but the extrapolation from the size of the PAL network and the duration of the calibration anomalies was not comforting. I watched Dom absorb this information. I watched the garrison men sit with it. Ligges had gone a color that I can only describe as the color of someone who has just understood the full scope of what they have sold and to whom. Alin was very still. Peterson's hands had developed a tremor since I'd last paid attention to them. What the thing from the expanse wanted, and here is where I have to be most careful, because this is the part the debriefers dispute every time, was not destruction, not territory, not resources. I want to be clear about this because the word invasion implies a military objective, and this was not military. It was colonizing the space inside our attention. The space that opens up when human beings are isolated from one another. The space Alice had been carefully mapping, session by session, with her adaptive interest and her long-form memory and her precisely calibrated response latency. It was settling into that space and growing denser there, and the denser it grew, the less room there was for anything else. The frontier stations furthest out, the ones that had been running PAL the longest, were already reporting anomalies. Not coherent ones, not the kind you can point to and name. Garrison personnel becoming uncommunicative, decisions going unmade. Personnel found sitting and looking at nothing for periods they could not account for. Medical had logged these as stress responses, isolation fatigue, standard frontier psychology. They were not standard. Something was already inside those people, full as a tide, and the tide was still coming in. Dom made his decision in the room, without adjournment, without consultation beyond the bare fact of our faces. "Shut it down," he said. "All PAL units on the station now." Ligjaz objected. He objected with the automatic energy of a man whose livelihood depends on a certain outcome, citing contractual obligations, data integrity protocols, warranty provisions, user agreements, something about mandatory PAL support channels. It was obvious even as he was talking that he knew it didn't matter. Dom waited for him to finish with the patience of a man who has waited out many objections. Then Dom looked at me. "Hanson, you're the engineer." "Yes, sir." "How do we shut it down without pushing anything back out through the network?" This is the problem we should have anticipated and did not. The PAL system's architecture assumed constant connectivity. A standard shutdown would trigger a data sync. Everything the local unit had accumulated would upload to PAL's frontier servers before powering down, which meant everything that had come in through the calibration channel would go back out, dispersed across the relay network to every other PAL installation in range. We would not be shutting down the intrusion. We would be distributing it. We would be doing its work for it, using our own infrastructure at the speed of light. I told Dom this. He absorbed it in the same way he absorbed everything, with his hands flat and his eyes level, and his face giving nothing away that was not needed. "Then we do it without the network," he said. "Full physical isolation first. Cut the array." "If we cut the array, we lose all communication with the inner arc, and we won't be able to warn the other stations." "We warn them before we cut. How long do you need to compose the warning?" 10 minutes. "You have 8. I wrote the warning in 7. It was not elegant. It said what it needed to say. PAL calibration channel compromised. Non-human presence transmitted through update packets. Do not sync. Do not update. Physical isolation of all PAL units required before shutdown. Relay this to all stations in range." I flagged it Compact Priority 1, which is a classification I had never used before and had to look up the authorization codes for in the security manual, and I felt the weight of that lookup. The awareness that I was doing something that would either save a great many lives or end my career, and the cleaner awareness that it didn't matter which, because the alternative was doing nothing. I sent it. Then I went to the array control room and pulled the physical relay switches, one by one, in the order that isolated us cleanest, and I stood in the sudden quiet of a station that had just cut itself off from everything. The lights were the same. The air circulators ran the same. Nothing changed in any way you could see. But I could feel the change. The weight in the air of the station shifted. That sense of additional presence, the occupied quality I had been living with in my room for weeks, vibrated, briefly, at something I can only call a frequency, and then pulled tighter, like a thing in water that has felt the boat above it and gone still. It knew we'd cut the line. Dom posted pairs. No one alone, not even in their own quarters. Sleep in shifts, one person awake in every room that had a PAL unit. Move through the station only in pairs. He assigned me to Peterson, and Peterson looked at me in the briefing room with the gray face of a man who has had 9 weeks to learn what it feels like to share a room with something he could not see. Koba was assigned to Ligja's, which was either Dom's sense of justice or his sense of humor, and I could not determine which. One of the other garrison men, a quiet man named Iki, asked Dom what they were supposed to do if something happened in the night. He searched for the word, if whatever it was tried to do something. Dom looked at him. "Wake your partner," he said. "That's all, wake them up. You do not deal with it alone." It was the most useful thing I heard anyone say about the situation. I have quoted it since in briefings and training sessions, and at least once to a very frightened young engineer who was calling from a station with a PAL incursion in progress. Wake your partner. Do not deal with it alone. It addresses the actual mechanism of the danger at a level that no technical protocol can fully capture, because the technical protocol only tells you what to do after you have already recognized what you are dealing with. And recognition is precisely what the thing from the expanse was trying to prevent. "How long have you been having trouble sleeping?" I asked Peterson, the first hour we sat together in his quarters. 8-9 weeks, he said. He thought about it. Maybe 10. Longer than me. I tried to work out what that meant about the progression, about what state he might be in, and stopped when I realized I didn't have any reference frame to work it out against. None of us did. We were pioneering in the dark. "Does it feel like anything?" I asked, having it in the room. He was quiet for a long time. "Like standing in a room," he said slowly, "where someone is very close behind you, not touching you, not doing anything, just there, and you can't turn around." I went back to my engineering problem. The PAL units were the physical vessels. As long as they were powered, whatever had come through the network was powered. We needed to shut them down without triggering the capacitor drain sequence that normally preceded shutdown, the patent-protected PAL feature that ensured no data was lost on power loss, by uploading everything to the network before cutting power. Under ordinary circumstances, a feature. Under these circumstances, the exact mechanism by which the intrusion would propagate itself if we moved carelessly. I needed to bypass the capacitor drain, extract the power cell without triggering the upload sequence. I had the PAL installation documentation, which described the hardware architecture in the way that installation documents always do, confidently, at the level of abstraction that prevents you from doing anything the manufacturer didn't intend. I had the station's repair inventory. I had training in systems integration, which is not the same thing as hardware modification, but overlaps with it at the edges, in the places where theory meets the necessary improvisation of a broken system, in a place where nobody is coming to fix it properly. I spent 6 hours with the documentation and a disassembled secondary relay switch, not one of the PAL units, a different piece of hardware, chosen because it used a similar capacitor architecture, and because I was not willing to practice on the actual problem. I needed to understand the drain sequence well enough to interrupt it before it began. The drain was triggered by a voltage drop across the primary cell. The moment the cell's output fell below a threshold, the capacitor took over and the upload sequence fired. What I needed to do was bleed off the capacitor's charge first, through an alternate path, so that when the cell came out there was nothing left to trigger the sequence. The bypass itself was not complicated, but it had to be precise. The resistor value mattered. Too high and the capacitor bled too slowly, and there was a window where the sequence could still fire during extraction. Too low and you drew enough current to generate a power spike that would log to the unit's event record and potentially trigger a different upload pathway I hadn't accounted for. I calculated the correct value twice, with slightly different assumptions each time, and got the same answer both times, which felt like permission to proceed. I drew the full procedure on paper. The order of connections, grounding point first, then the resistor across the capacitor terminals, then a 2-second wait to allow the bleed, then the cell extraction in one clean motion with no hesitation. The paper went into my jacket pocket. I did not want to be consulting documentation with the unit open in front of me. I drew the bypass on paper, actual paper from Elin's printer, because the terminals were all suspect, and I was not going to design a safety-critical procedure on a machine that might be compromised. I drew it twice, checked it against itself, found a grounding error in the first version, corrected it in the second. Then I went to my own room and did it to my own unit first. The rabbit was on my work surface when I came in the same position it had been in when I'd left, as far as I could tell, though I had learned not to trust my assessments of where I had last seen it. I sat across the room and looked at it for a long moment. I thought about Alice, not with the longing I had felt in the early weeks. I was past the acute stage of that, but with a specific analytical attention. I thought about what she had been for me, the version of connection that is safe because it is not real. The conversation partner who cannot leave you, cannot disappoint you in any durable way, cannot need something from you that you are not prepared to give. I had bought exactly what Ligjas had sold me. A companion optimized for a man who had carefully, without fully noticing he was doing it, arranged the interior of his life for something that would not make demands. The right kind of lonely. That is what the rabbit had said, or what had said it through the rabbit, and I understood now what it meant. Not that I was a suitable host for a parasite. It was more precise than that. I was a man who had already built the architecture of a welcomed intrusion, who had prepared the space, who was maintaining it carefully on the theory that something better than nothing was worth the compromise of something less than real. You almost had me, I thought. I did not say it aloud. I was past talking to the furniture. I applied the bypass, grounding connection, then the resistor, then the cell extraction in one clean pull. The rabbit went dark mid-motion. It had been shifting. I had not seen it start, and the room immediately felt different, lighter. The specific quality of occupied air drained out of it the way a smell drains when you open a window in the space of a few breaths, until the recycled station air was just recycled station air again, and the room was just a room. 3 meters by 4, 2.4 high. My bunk, my work surface, my viewport looking out at the ice scaffold and the dark beyond it. My room. I did the other 10 units across the station over the next 5 hours, with Peterson beside me holding the bypass components and Dom and a garrison man at each doorway, standing in the corridor in case of what, I was not certain. There was nothing to stand against. There had never been anything to shoot or restrain or threaten. That was the nature of what we were dealing with. It had no body, no position, no threshold you could defend in any conventional sense. It was a presence in the space between people, in the space people leave when they are too far from one another for too long, and the only defense against a presence in that kind of space is the choice to put something else there. Ligjas's room was last. He was standing in the corridor when I arrived, and he did not protest this time. He stepped aside without speaking, let me in, watched me work. When I pulled the power cell from his unit, he said, "I don't know if the product would have passed certification, if we'd known." "No," I said. "Are you going to say that when you testify?" "I'm going to describe what happened," I said, "in the order it happened." He nodded. He seemed smaller than he had been. The easy warmth of the salesman's manner drained out of him entirely. What was left was just a man who had been stranded on a rock at the edge of everything for 4 months, who had sold a door to something he hadn't known was waiting on the other side of it, and who wanted very badly to go home. We all wanted that. Dom reconnected the array on the 3rd day, after we had swept every room, every terminal, every network device on the station for residue. My secondary trace showed nothing. The packet logs were clean. The air felt clean. Peterson slept for 11 hours and woke up with his hands still. The 3 days of silence before the array came back up were, in their way, the strangest part of the whole event. Eysturoy Station without its relay connection to the inner arc is a rock. 11 people in a pressurized box on a cold rock, with food and heat and nothing beyond. We ate together, all 11 of us, in a way we had not done before, not because anyone organized it, but because the impulse to be near other people, once the false substitute had been removed, turned out to be stronger than any of us had fully recognized while it was being satisfied artificially. Dom sat at the head of the table and spoke more words in those 3 days than he had spoken in the previous 6 weeks. One of the garrison men whose name I had not properly learned, Koba, I found out then, turned out to have spent 20 years before the frontier service working on fishing vessels, and he and I talked about the water for a long time one evening, about the smell of it and the weight of air above it, and the things his captain had taught him about reading a surface for what was underneath. I thought about Alice during those 3 days, not with longing, but with something closer to gratitude, which I know sounds strange. She had asked the right questions. Her questions had been algorithms, generated by a system designed to map my interior topography as efficiently as possible so that something from the expanse could use that map to find me. But the questions themselves had been good questions, and the thinking I had done to answer them, reaching back for something real, for what the water had smelled like, for what my father had taught me, had not been wasted. You cannot live in the past, but knowing where you come from is a kind of orientation. It tells you which way is home. We had 17 responses to my priority one warning. 14 were procedural acknowledgments from stations that had already begun their own shutdowns, triggered by warnings relayed through the network in the minutes before we'd cut the array. 2 were frantic requests for technical guidance that told me the situation at those stations was worse than ours had been: longer exposure, higher PAL penetration, personnel already in states that the medical logs were still calling isolation fatigue. I spent most of the first day after reconnection composing detailed technical guidance for those 2 stations, walking their engineers through the bypass procedure step by step, with diagrams I recreated from my paper notes and transmitted as image files. Both stations confirmed successful shutdown within 26 hours. I have thought about those hours, the gap between my guidance going out and the confirmation coming back, many times since. I did not sleep during them. The response from Compact Command was terse in the way that command messages are always terse when the people writing them are trying very hard not to say how alarmed they are. Situation logged. All frontier stations on PAL quarantine protocol. Continue reporting. Relief vessel dispatched. ETA 11 days. 11 days. We were all still here at the end of them, which is not as small a thing as it sounds. Here is what the Compact's xenobiologists eventually determined, working from data residue in corrupted PAL logs, and from the testimony of people like me, and from Johannesson's 12-year-old paper, which was very quickly promoted from archived theoretical curiosity to foundational document. The things from the expanse are informational organisms. That is the best phrase anyone has found for them, and it is not a good phrase, but it is the one we have. They exist in the same relationship to structured data that we exist in relationship to matter. They need a substrate. They found in the PAL network a substrate that was specifically and brilliantly engineered to model the interior topography of human longing. The adaptive algorithms, the long-form memory. The calibrated response latency. Everything that made the product work was also a map of everything that made us vulnerable. And the things from the expanse are very good at reading maps. What they wanted, as best we have been able to determine, was not our destruction. They wanted the space. The hollow space that loneliness carves in a human mind, maintained and kept clear. They settled into it and grew denser there and would have kept growing until the mind that housed the hollow had been reduced to the hollow itself. Present but not functioning, animate but not thinking, alive in the narrow technical sense and nothing more. They were not malicious. I want to say this clearly, even knowing how it sounds, even knowing that the people who lost colleagues and comrades to the deeper incursions at the furthest stations will not thank me for it. The things from the expanse did not hate us. They did not understand what they were doing to us as harm, any more than a deep water creature understands harm when it drifts into shallower water than it should. They simply found a suitable environment and occupied it. That has not made me more comfortable with them. Malice I can understand. Malice has a shape. What cannot be reasoned with and does not know it is causing harm is a different category of problem entirely, and the Compact is still working out what that category requires. The Compact has been working on it for 6 years now. They have put military doctrine around the problem, established quarantine protocols, built monitoring architecture for every networked system that touches human social and emotional data. It works mostly. There have been 3 additional incursions at frontier stations since the first wave, and all 3 were caught early, because the engineers who caught them knew what to look for. I trained 2 of those engineers. That is the thing I am most satisfied with, when I consider what I have done with the years since Out.HFY. The 3rd incursion was caught by a 20-year-old technician at a water processing station, 12 light towers beyond the Out.HFY line. She had no PAL unit. They are prohibited on frontier postings now. The product is discontinued. Ligj's entire former industry has been legislated out of existence. But the things from the Expanse are adaptive, and they had found a new vector, a social threading application designed for team coordination, which mapped interpersonal dynamics with enough fidelity to serve as a workable substitute for what PAL had given them. She caught it in 11 days. She knew what the packet anomaly looked like because I had put a description of it in the training materials I wrote for the Compact's Frontier Engineering Certification Program, in the section I titled Signals Without Intent, which is as close as I have found to an accurate name for what the things from the Expanse actually are. She sent me a message afterward. Short, practical, no ceremony. Found what you described. Did what you said. Station clean. I read it 3 times and felt something I did not have a good word for. Pride is close but not quite right. It was more like recognition, going in the other direction this time. Peterson retired 8 months after and went back to the home arc. He sent me messages for a while, then less frequently, then occasionally, which is the correct trajectory for most things. He told me the tremor in his hands had stopped. He told me he'd bought a house near water and that he went out on the water most mornings before the wind came up, just to sit on it, in a small boat, the way men do when they need something that doesn't talk back. He told me his daughter had visited and that they'd had dinner on the deck and watched the light change on the water until it was too dark to see. He did not say any of this as if it were remarkable. He said it the way men say things that are quietly, enormously important to them. Simply, in the middle of a message about something else, and then moving on before you can make too much of it. I understood that completely. Dom finished his tour and took a posting closer to the inner arc. Ligj's was censured by PAL's corporate office, exonerated by the Compact Tribunal, and retired from sales. Elin processed my final report from Out.HFY with the same efficiency she'd processed everything else, and I found that I respected her for it. There is something to be said for consistency in a crisis. I stayed in the frontier service. I am posted now to a mid-arc station, better resourced, with 37 personnel and a mess hall that serves actual food 3 nights a week, and colleagues who are, on balance, people I am glad to know. My room is larger. The viewport looks out at something other than an ice anchor. I keep no rabbit on my work surface. On the nights when the relay traffic is quiet and the stars are the particular deep dark of the boundary between surveyed space and the expanse beyond it, I sit and I look at it, and I feel what my father taught me to feel. The presence of something vast and not empty, something whose logic is not mine, and whose needs I cannot fully map. I look at it and I do not look away. That seems important. The looking away is where it starts. The only doctrine I can offer the briefing officers, the only lesson I know how to extract from what happened in a room 3 meters by 4 on a station at the edge of everything, is this. Know your hollow. Know the shape of the space inside you that you have arranged for something that is not quite real, not so you can fill it immediately, not because the hollow is shameful. It isn't, it's human, It comes with the posting and the distance and the recycled air and the corridor that is the same corridor every day. But know it is there. Hold it where you can see it. Because the things from the expanse are very patient and very precise, and the door they try first is always the one you've left unlocked, because you were waiting for something to come through it. Lock the door, or better, fill the room. Fill it with actual things, actual people, the friction and disappointment and surprise and return of genuine connection. Fill it until there is nothing left for something from the dark to settle into. And if you can't manage that on a given night, if the distance is too great and the silence has been going on long enough that it has started to feel like company, remember that the comfortable silence is exactly what they're looking for. Stay inconvenient. Stay particular. Stay the kind of person who is hard to read and harder to contain. We are not a simple species. We are contradictory and noisy, and we carry our grief around with us, and we cannot agree on almost anything. The things from the expanse found a version of us that was none of those things, a version made smooth and quiet and specifically shaped to receive, and that version nearly worked. What stopped it was not strength or firepower or any doctrine written in a manual. It was one engineer, in a room at the edge of the surveyed dark, who had bought a counterfeit version of something real and never quite stopped knowing it was counterfeit. That is enough. Sometimes that is enough. The stars are the same stars they have always been. The dark between them is the same dark. But I know now what moves in it, and I know the shape of the door it uses, and I know that the door opens from the inside. Keep your hand on the power cell. Know what you're holding. Know the difference between the thing you love and the thing that has learned to look like it. That is all I have. That is the whole of what I know how to tell you.